Hello everybody and welcome to this video on the context of Arthur Conan Doyle's The Sign of Four. Everything you see in this video comes from Mr. Bruff's Guide to the Sign of Four, which you can pick up through following the links in the description. The context of The Sign of Four is particularly important as the novel is set during a very turbulent time in British social history. The first thing to talk about is the development of detection. As mentioned in the previous video, the fictional Sherlock Holmes and the all-too-real Jack the Ripper share the same city. The first appearance of Holmes in 1887 came just a year before the Whitechapel murders. There was public outcry at the time for the lack of movement on the case, and the public perceived the police force as inefficient, and their failures in this case caused widespread derision. There were complaints from the poor in the East End to Queen Victoria herself, who stated that the detective department was not as efficient as it might be. This guy here on the screen, Sir Robert Peel, the Home Secretary in 1822, established the Metropolitan Police in 1829. He considered that London had no citywide, organised, dedicated police force, and it was a major job for a new force to take on to rid the streets of crime. At first they were largely distrusted by the people. Peel himself said that the officers were to be recruited from the lower classes, and this was highlighted by the fact that many of the first officers were unable to read. By recruiting this way, Peel believed poor people on the streets of London wouldn't feel as if justice were being imposed upon them by those above them, but by their peers. And by the end of the century, the trust and affection for the Peelers or the Bobbies had grown to the point that a threatened strike resulted in the newspapers of the time begging the force to reconsider because the people would be at the mercy of the city's criminals. In the 1840s, attempts were made at establishing a detective force, and particularly an undercover detective branch. This, to the Englishmen of the era, was contemptible. It was resisted by the public and politicians as foreign espionage, something they might do in another country, but certainly not in England, and that they wouldn't really need to do in England. And Charles Dickens, the famous writer, was a huge admirer of the idea, but most people thought it was a bad idea, and it wasn't until the 1870s that there was a dedicated, regular working detective department in the Met, the CID, the Criminal Investigation Department. 10 years after the establishment of this department, the crimes of Jack the Ripper became front-page news, and citizens of London were calling for something to be done. The Met CID had grown to over 800 men, but its main problem, and one that's explored in The Sign of Four, was the idea of reputation. The police, in the case of the Whitechapel murders, had too fixed an idea of what the culprit would be like, and as such discounted anyone from an upper-class part of London as well as any gentleman. And this approach to the case was emblematic of the class structure of London and England in general of the Victorian period, and seriously hampered the approach of the detectives. These days, of course, we are well aware that anybody from any background and any social status can commit any crime. So this period was also characterised by the development of new techniques that aided the police, and ones which Holmes himself uses. Fingerprints, for example. In fact, Sherlock Holmes' use of this technique has pretty much predates the official police use of them. Fingerprinting was introduced in the early 1900s, whereas Holmes uses it as an early form of it anyway in The Sign of Four to get a measure of Tonga's footprints, which proves a valuable clue in his deduction of the case. As well as taking place before a backdrop of rapid and monumental change in terms of policing and detection strategies and techniques, Arthur Conan Doyle's protagonist is also dealing with many issues which are offshoots of social upheaval and great national change. In The Sign of Four, the idea of empire, colony and treasure play an important role. The wealth that Britain had accumulated through its empire and colonies overseas was enormous. The growing living standard seen throughout Britain, although not all of it has to be said, was a direct result of the growing industrialisation and importation and exportation of goods and people to and from all corners of the British Empire. The huge swelling of the population of London in the 19th century was, in part, down to the influx of people from these colonies who were looking to make their fortune or returning from living abroad. And this meant a city with a huge mix of ethnicities and cultures. For the indigenous English, many of whom had never set foot outside of London, there was a fresh tension mixed with fear. The fear of the other was palpable in Victorian London, and in the Sign of 4 plays a significant role too. Also, at the edge of the populace's mind was the fear of uprising in the colonies. While the struggles for independence occurred in the years following the publication of the Sign of 4, the fear of it is never far away. In 1857, one of the British Empire's biggest and most important colonies, India, began its first attempt at independence, which became known in the mind of the British establishment and public as the Indian Mutiny. This rebellion or uprising was due to the accumulation of a number of different factors. The army controlling India for the British Empire was made up of 50,000 British soldiers, but 300,000 sepoys or Indian soldiers from a variety of backgrounds. And the rebellion in 1857 was an attempt to rid India of British rule, and particularly the East India Company's rule over India and surrounding areas. The end result of the mutiny was victory for the British Empire, the restructuring of the army and the governance structures in India, and the transfer of complete control of the region to the British Crown. This rule, however, only lasted for a further 90 years, and in 1947 India was granted its independence from Britain. Reaction to all this in Britain was quite one-sided. Due to the reported atrocities carried out by the rebelling Indians, Britain sought retribution in a violent and swift way. Sympathies in London and other parts of Britain naturally lay with their nation, and this certainly coloured how Britain saw and thought of the empire and its colonies. And this is an important contextual detail to bear in mind for the book, as we see representations of people from India in a very particular light, despite the fact that Arthur Conan Doyle was often known as someone with sympathies for those who were oppressed. One of the things that surprises many modern readers is Holmes's drug use. The Sign of 4 begins with Holmes and Watson discussing the use of drugs, and we are confronted with the vision of Holmes taking a 7% solution of cocaine intravenously. When Watson sees this, he questions morphine or cocaine, and obviously that suggests that he's well used to using drugs. The modern day reader, understanding the dangers of drug abuse, naturally finds this surprising, and especially for someone who's so famed for their powers of mind. But it's important to remember the context. In the Victorian period, drugs such as cocaine and morphine were both legal and widely used for a variety of complaints. Most people at this time were simply unaware of the dangers of these drugs, and Holmes says that he used them to keep his mind stimulated before cases, saying, "My mind," he said, "rebels at stagnation. Give me problems, give me work, give me the most abstruse cryptogram or the most intricate analysis, and I am in my own proper atmosphere. I can dispense them with the artificial stimulants, but I abhor the dull routine of existence." So Holmes reportedly injects a 7% solution up to 3 times daily, which is a substantial amount. Add to this that he's also a user of morphine, which is a purer version of heroin, and we see Sherlock Holmes in a slightly different light. Despite the fact that these drugs were legal and Holmes was not breaking the law, a medical man such as Watson disapproves deeply and lets him know about it. Count the cost. Your brain may, as you say, be roused and excited, but it's a pathological and morbid process which involves increased tissue change and may at last leave a permanent weakness. Watson's opposition to Holmes's drug use first appears in the Sign of 4, but continues throughout many of the stories. Mr. Bruff's Guide to Arthur Conan Doyle's The Sign of 4 is an absolute must-have title for anybody studying this text. For just £3.99 you can get my guide, which contains the complete Sherlock Holmes story, as well as detailed analysis, 50 pages nearly of analysis. That's chapter summaries, the author, setting, context, genre, character analysis of Sherlock Holmes, Watson, Miss Mary Morstan, analysis of language, analysis of structure, and a sample question and answer, exactly the kind of thing you need for your GCSE studies, as well as the complete original text. Just £3.99 at mrbruff.com. Please do pick up a copy.